Hey everybody, my name is Dowden, and in this video, I'm going to give you 11 essential tips that you need to know for producing organic house and deep house music. Some of these tips are beginner or surface level, but they are really important in creating the specific style of deep house and organic house. But make sure to watch till the end of the video to find out one of the cooler techniques that I included as the last tip. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe with notifications on so you get more videos like this one, and make sure to download the free sample pack that is included in the description below. All right, let's get started. The 10 tips I'm going to give you all pertain to this organic house, deep house style track that I made that we can take a listen to right now. So starting it off, tip number 1 is tuning instruments. Tuning instruments, especially for this style of music, which has a lot of tonal instruments, such as congas and bongos, it can really hold back the quality of your track and make it feel a little bit off-putting, even if it's just slightly out of tune. Checking your instruments to make sure that they are in the key of your track is going to help bring that track to a more professional quality. So let's go ahead and take a look at one of our toms here. So I have this high tom, it sounds like this. And to check the key, I can either use a tuner or an EQ. The tuner doesn't work all the time. It looks like the tuner is picking up that it's in C sharp. Let's double check with the EQ. I'm going to look over here and see the frequency and the key. And it does say that it is in C sharp, and C sharp is in the scale that I'm using for this track. So I know that I am happy with the key that it is in, and I can leave it as is. But say we had something that was out of key, it might look something more like this. And we'll check the EQ again. We're hitting about a G sharp now, but it's not too high. So instead of bringing it one whole semitone down, I'm going to transpose just by some cents here. So about half a semitone. And that's going to bring me to the G. So something to keep in mind is that not all drums are tuned to the note accurately. It could be that it's only a few cents out, which is here in this D tune, rather than in the transposition. This will be full semitones, and this will be 1/100th of a semitone. So you can move that up and down to get a more accurate tuning. Tip number 2 is going to be using loops. And I know this is a little bit controversial because some people don't want to be using loops in their music, but it's a great way to add a little bit extra to your track, especially if you're a newer producer. I don't think that you should rely heavily on loops. I think that you should use them as a sort of tool to bring your tracks a little bit further forward in terms of quality. If you look at this track, almost everything I have is programmed by me, but I do have a couple of things in here that I've used as loops, like the shaker loop, for example. I actually made that loop by combining 2 other shaker loops, but both of those shaker loops that I combined into one were both really good loops that added a lot of quality, a lot of value to my song, and I don't think I could have achieved that using just my own hi-hats at the time. My other loop that I have is down here as this percussion. It's nice and swingy. It's not overly complicated, but I thought that it felt the track, and instead of spending time recreating that simple loop, I thought that it would be good just to add it in. So don't be afraid to use loops, but I suggest using them in a way that is complementary to your track. You're not just grabbing loops, throwing them in, and calling it your own track. You're using them to add a little bit of seasoning on top of the rest of your track. So tip number 3 is going to be identifying and using different types of shakers for this style of music. So with deep house and organic house, we're not just relying on hi-hats and shakers that you might be using in other genres, but it's very common to hear other styles of these shaker loops, such as egg shakers or tambourines. These instruments are more organic sounding, they're more humanized, and they can add a lot of depth. They can add a lot of groove and swing to the track. They sound very realistic and human-like. So this loop is 2 loops that I took and put together. Let's take a listen to the track with the shaker loop that I created first. So it's using just a stock shaker. It's not very organic sounding. It's not very interesting sounding. It's very, very white, noisy, and not that many dynamics to it. And then comparing it to the organic shaker loop, There's so much more going on. It's so much more interesting, and there's just so much more ear candy. It's really a pleasant shaker, and it adds so much depth to our tracks. Let's listen before with shaker 1 and the organic shaker loop. So both shakers work, but the organic shaker loop that I've added is way more fulfilling. It's got a lot more depth. There's nothing wrong with shaker 1. It's just that it doesn't suit this style as well as the organic shaker loops. So what I would suggest doing is getting your hands on some really nice organic style shaker loops. I'll put links to my favorite in the description below. And if you insist on not using loops and making your own, then that leads me into my next tip. My next 2 tips, actually. The tip 4 is velocity changing. Going into the MIDI information and changing the velocity of each of these hits, we can see that I've done this kind of waving, and I suggest grabbing each and just moving them independently so that each hit is just a little bit different. We can also do this with a velocity tool by dragging that velocity tool onto the channel. It appears before the instrument, and you can turn up the random. I suggest maybe 10 to 15, maybe even 20 if you're feeling wild. Pushing this just a little bit gives us a bit of randomization in the drums. Pretty simple, but very effective. This is without changing the velocities. And then with. It's much groovier and more interesting than just stagnant repeating of those 16th notes. Let's combine this shaker loop that's a little bit stagnant and repetitive into my more complex shaker loop that brings us to tip number 5, which is layering shakers. So I have the shaker loop 2 here, which is going to sound much better than shaker loop 1. So it's wide, it has a bit more dynamic sound to it, it's more interesting. And what I've done here is layered up 2 of these shakers. So I'm going to go into the MIDI information. You can see that I have the velocity changes, as I just mentioned in my last tip. And then I have these 2 shakers working together. Little bonus tip, if the sample itself is not in time with the track, so if I turn off this warp here, the shaker is out of time. So what you can do is have the warp on, and click 1 beat, and that will turn it into a 1 beat sound. And now it's in time with the track. Layering up multiple shakers, especially ones that are very different from each other, that are a little bit more dynamic and swingy, will make your shaker loops sound way more interesting because you have these shakers that are kind of flowing into each other, that are moving around, adding the velocity on top of this, as well as maybe some stereo width, which I have here. And then you could even do some auto panning. This is going to make your shakers feel a lot more alive, interesting, organic, and humanized. So let's take a listen to both those shakers now. I'll turn this first shaker down. So it's a lot more interesting now. Still not as great as the shaker loops that I have in a sample pack and layered up. Actually, that second layer is my sample that I made in my Dowden organic sample pack. It's absolutely free. It comes with a bunch of organic samples, so go ahead and click that in the description below. And let's layer up all 3 of these shakers now. There's a lot going on. It's really full, it's really swingy, and it's really interesting and professional sounding. The tip number 6 is making your percussions more hook-ish. What I mean by that is making sure every instrument that you're adding is complementary to the groove. The style of music is very percussion heavy, and it relies on these percussive elements to really carry the track's momentum. The groovier the track, the more people are probably going to want to dance to it, and that is the whole point of this genre of music. It's house music, it's dancey. The more experience we have, the more we can identify what is groovy and what's not, and what to add and what not to add. But for this example, I've kept it very simple. Let's take a listen to just the kick along with the percussive elements to show you how simple these grooves add up to make an overall track really groovy. So I'm just adding 1 or 2 notes in most of these and building each layer with 1 or 2 notes in a place in the actual loop that is adding groove. So every one of these should be adding a bit more of that bouncy groove that we are looking for. So the idea is that every layer that I'm adding, it's making it more interesting. It's making me want to bop my head and groove even more. If you do add an instrument and it seems that it's pulling away that desire to groove, then it's probably not in the best position of the drum programming, and you can move it back and forth to kind of find out exactly where it should be. And this is again why using loops is so valuable, because maybe you're not great at deciding where to put these groovy elements, then you can rely on loops to kind of help fill that gap. Number 7 is going to be using field recordings or textures to fill the background and the depth and space of your track. For this example, I have this field recording of people just talking. It's just ambient, people's voices. Layering this in with the rest of the track will kind of give this really low, quiet layer of glue over the entire track. And you'll hear people using things, field recordings of birds chirping or the rain falling or the beaches. And these things are very interesting to keep in the background because they're always changing. So let's take a listen with and without and see if you can hear. So it adds just this little layer of depth to the track, and it makes it a little bit more interesting subconsciously, because your ears, even if you don't pay attention to it primarily, your ears are picking up on it and they do hear it, even if it's just a little bit. We'll try with another example of just using room ambience that I recorded using Audacity. I just made some tapping noises, then you can export that, bring that into Ableton and make a loop out of it. Make sure to EQ out the low end. A lot of the time, ambience has a ridiculously fat low end. We want to make sure we're cutting that out. Throw some reverb on there. Push the width up. So it adds just this little layer of depth to the track, and it makes it a little bit more interesting subconsciously, because your ears, even if you don't pay attention to it primarily, your ears are picking up on it and they do hear it, even if it's just a little bit. Number 8 is going to be using samples. What do I mean by that? Of course, we're using samples, we're using drums and everything, but I love grabbing samples from somewhere like Loop Cloud or Splice. So I'm going to open up my Splice here. And I could search up here for things that relate to this Middle Eastern style. So instruments from the Middle East, or Asian instruments, or sitars, things that you can think of that would kind of be based around the sample packs and the sample styles that would go well with Deep House or Organic House. So if I were to search something like sitar, I can stumble across this pack called Sitar Effects. And this will have some really nice Middle Eastern style samples that I want to use. So I've already used one of these here. Let's grab the sample here and take a listen. So I want to make sure that it's in the key of my track. Right here it says D minor. So that should work. Let me go ahead and drop that into a new channel here and just throw some reverb on that channel and some delay. And let's take a listen. Pretty happy with that. It sounds pretty cool. And all I had to do was find this really nice sample inside of Splice and drag and drop that onto my project. This is a great way to elevate your track to sound more professional, have a higher quality, and sometimes it's better to grab these realistic and these authentic samples rather than using synthesizers all the time to give it, again, that more organic, humanized, realistic feel. Tip number 9 is using proper scales. So I found 2 really great scales to be using in this style of music. They're very Middle Eastern sounding. One is the Egyptian scale, and it sounds like this. And one is the Arabic scale, and it sounds like this. Both very Middle Eastern sounding. If you stay within this scale, then the sounds that you're going to be putting into your track are going to have that Middle Eastern influence. And a lot of the organic house and deep house style comes with this sort of vibe within the music. We can take a listen. So what we could do with this scale is actually push the scale behind like this, get rid of all these extra notes here, push all these over to the left, behind our actual MIDI track, and now when we click the fold button, we're only going to be left with these notes. And when I play the track, I can start to write my own MIDI however I see fit by clicking on these notes that I know are in the scale. In this way, you can write your own melodies using that scale without having to rely on memorizing the scale, or if you're not great at playing piano, then you can do it this way as well. Tip number 10 is going to be using toms as your bass sounds. This is very common in this style of music because the toms give this nice kind of top end to the bass sound that's not as electric or synthesized sounding, but more realistic and human sounding. So we can grab a tom sample, but we're looking for one that's nice and clean. This one sounds a little detuned. This one's very clean, but very high end. This one sounds really nice. So this bass tom I've used here, I'm going to swap that out with this one. Sounds a little bit low, so I'll push this up 1 octave here. Duplicate that over. And we can see that I have a sub frequency here. Looks pretty clean. I have another sub frequency that's more like a bass frequency, a little bit higher. And that's going to be a pretty powerful sounding bass. Nice and groovy. Of course, we have to be careful. Using something other than a pure sine wave for the sub bass might be recommended to cut out some of that low end and draw in your own sub frequency, but with some careful EQing, compression, and processing, we can ensure that this bass tom will work as a bass. And if you want to just use the high end, you can just put in your own low frequencies, your sub and your bass, and just use the high end of the tom as a complementary sound to that bass to make it sound like you're just using the tom. Tip number 11 is going to be using this sidechain pulling effect. Is going to be using sidechain compression to actually give a more of a push and pull effect that goes beyond the usual that you get with typical sidechain compression. So I'm going to go into my shaker loop here, and I have some light sidechain compression on here that's sidechained to the kick drum. It's just giving a little bit of groove. It's ducking for that kick and giving a bit of swing and push and pull. But to make this push and pull even more exaggerated and to give even more of that pulsing effect is to tastefully increase the release time and decrease the threshold. This will give even more sidechain compression. It'll actually be overdoing the sidechain compression, but if you do it properly, it gives this really nice pulsing effect that kind of makes you anticipate the next beat before it's coming in. It's pretty subtle, but it's a pretty cool trick. We'll pull down the threshold. So we're compressing quite a bit, and now I'm going to increase the release. It almost creates a bit of a separate groove. It's kind of almost delayed, like it's trying to catch up, and that gives us that bit of swing. I'm not actually hitting 0 on my gain reduction here because the release is so long. So maybe I want to push this up a couple dB. And I'm going to show you the before with the regular sidechain compression and after with this new push and pull sidechain compression that I'm calling it. Regular sidechain compression, push and pull. I'm going to turn up the shaker so that it's much more pronounced in the context of the mix. And we're listening for that slight delay in that sidechain compression pumping. It's not very obvious, but if you pay close attention to it, it does give off a little bit different of a groove, which makes it just feel a little bit more interesting and a little bit more dancey. All right, everybody, thanks for watching. I hope you learned something and I hope you enjoyed. If you're new to the channel or you haven't already subscribed, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you get more videos like this one. Hey, if you like this video, make sure to give me a thumbs up. It helps out tremendously, and grab the free sample pack that is in the description below. And I will see you in the next video.